Today we're taking a look at one of the most iconic toilets of all time, the 4th generation American Standard Cadet toilet. This is probably one of the most iconic vintage toilets of all time, being first introduced all the way back in 1961, and this particular design would be featured up until 1982. Now they would put the 4th generation balls over to 3.5 gallons for a little bit up until around circa 1984, when it will be replaced with the dreaded 5th generation. This toilet changes some things up too. Originally the Cadets were only offered in round bowl. But not only could you get this toilet in round bowl, but you could also get it elongated too. And eventually around 1965 or so, you would also get this in comfort height as well. Now we'll be reviewing the comfort height Cadet of the 5-gallon variation in a different review because it's actually a bit different compared to its standard height variants. Today we're mostly going to be focusing on the standard height versions, both round and elongated. There's many different reasons why this toilet is very iconic, so let's take a look at it and see what it has to offer. The overall design of this toilet is not bad at all. It's somewhat of a classical design for its time. The interesting thing is, considering this was introduced in 1961, seeing a rounded base is pretty surreal for its time. Nowadays it's nothing spectacular, but considering that it was somewhat of an interesting design for its time, that's something to note. And who could forget the iconic arch trap opening that this toilet has, featuring a siphon jet towards the bottom. Can't go wrong with it. Now we take a look inside the classic 4049 tank, with the tank parts. You can tell that the fill valve is replaced with a Fluid Master one, usually it would have a ball cock in here instead. But everything else is mostly original, including the classic American Standard handle, and even the tilt valve that it has. I've had my questions about this tilt valve, but I gotta say, American Standard's tank parts during this time were very solidly built. Most of the time, I don't really see these tilt valves in here. Usually it's like a standard flapper replacement or a replacement base with a new flapper. But I gotta say, very solid quality tank parts for its time. Let's take a look at a flush. Not bad at all. Now I will note that sometimes the flushes can be different. Sometimes it could be better, sometimes it could be worse. It really depends on the tank parts I've been noticing. Because if the tank parts are set low or not very good, then the toilet itself will not be very good. So I'm not faulting the quality control at all or this toilet. I just thought I'd throw that in. So I gotta say, the overall pulling and siphon power is not bad at all. It's pretty solid for a toilet like this. Sure, you can argue that sometimes with weaker flushes it can be a little bit worse, but if the parts are standard and not set too low or have any particular issues, the pulling factor is pretty decent on this thing. And the siphon's pretty long too if the flush is proper. Not bad at all. Another neat thing about this toilet is its great performance. This thing is a very strong performer and rarely clogs at all. Now I'm not saying it's impossible to clog one, but these things are pretty tough in its performance. Now I will say the comfort height version is a lot better and a lot more unstoppable compared to this, but it's still a great performer for its time. Especially compared to other toilets made today. Like, it's not even a contest how great this thing is in terms of performance. Now let's have a look at ball rinse. For the most part, the ball rinse is pretty good. The swirl and the angled rim jets definitely help out with the rinsing. I definitely think a few more rim jets could have helped it to be pretty great, but for the most part, it's not bad at all, and in fact, it's pretty solid. For its time, it's pretty good ball rinse. And that is the 4th generation American Standard Cadet toilet, truly an iconic toilet for its time. It's no wonder why this toilet was everywhere in the 60s and 70s and why it was very common back in the day. It's truly one of the greatest toilets of all time, and you'll never see anything like this ever again. It's truly iconic for a reason. If only it stayed that way in the 5th generation, but what can you do? But let's put this toilet into the grading scale. Let's grade it. The overall design of this toilet is such a classic, man. I just can't get enough of it. From the classic 4049 tank to the rounded base of this toilet. Everything about this toilet is such a classic. And while this toilet may look old nowadays, but for something introduced in the 1960s, this toilet was pretty ahead of its time. That's why it's getting a 7 in design. I gotta say, the tank parts from this timeline were pretty solid. It's actually nice to see some quality parts for an old toilet like this. The one thing that surprised me the most was the tilt valve and how well it worked. It's just as good as any simple flapper. And the best part is, even if some of these parts look pretty alien to most people, they can be interchanged at any time if needed, which is quite nice. Overall, the tank parts are pretty solid, and I have to give them a 7. The quality control overall is not bad at all. Most of these hold up and function fairly well and rarely have problems. It doesn't mean that it's always perfect though, as I have seen some weird ones that don't function that well, especially are super sluggish. But thankfully that's pretty rare. Most of these actually hold up fairly well, especially if most of the tank parts actually work. The quality control gets a 7. The trapway may be simple and may look unassuming, but it honestly delivers a lot more than you might expect. Overall, the trapway may be simple, but it works fairly well. So it's getting a 7. The flush is not bad at all. It may be a simple swirly flush, but it's done pretty well. As long as it's given the proper water usage, it works fairly well. While it may be simple, the flush is such a classic. The flush gets a 7. The pulling and siphon power is a lot better than I expected for this toilet. The pulling factor is actually pretty unassuming at first, but it's actually a lot stronger than you might think. And of course this thing siphons out fairly well. Of course if the flush is abrupt and or very short, then of course the pulling and siphon power is not going to be that great. But if you get this thing the full 5 gallons it needs, it works fairly well. That's why I'm giving it a 7. The performance is almost just near perfect. While it may not reach the heights of the Comfort Height version, which is pretty much unstoppable, it's very close to being unstoppable though. These things are pretty tough at performance, and rarely, if ever, clog. It's such a great performer. The performance is like nothing you've ever seen. It may not be the Comfort Height Cadet, but it's pretty close. That's why the performance is getting a 9. It's a great performer. The ball rinse for the most part is pretty good, covering the area pretty well with its swirl and angled rim jets. I definitely think it could have used a couple more rim jets to help it out, but overall it's pretty good and I have to give it an 8. These things have pretty good and pretty strong durability and survivability. These things can last a very good long time. They just don't make them like they used to anymore. The survivability gets an 8. Now let's talk about the overall value of the 4th generation American Standard Cadet toilet. It's easy to consider why this toilet is considered to be one of the greatest of all time. You just never will see anything like this toilet ever again. Everything about this toilet is pretty strong. The strong durability, the great performance, the good ball rinse, the decent flush and pulling factor, everything just ties together to make a pretty solid model. It's pretty easy to see why this toilet was sought out so much in the 60s and 70s, and even still to this very day. It's a very iconic toilet, and it's easy to see why there's so much popularity with these toilets. These toilets were built to last. It's easy to see why this is one of the greatest toilets of all time, and why it easily scores an 8 in value. The final score of the 4th generation American Standard Cadet toilet is a 75 out of 100. You just can't beat one of the greats. It's easy to see why this toilet is so sought after and why it's one of the most popular toilets of the 1960s and 70s. These were built with so much love and care, and not only that, they were built to last. What a great toilet. You just can't beat a classic 4th generation Cadet.